Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heeten, Kalan. I'm South African. I live in Boston. I work at the New World Foundation in New York City, and I also chair the board of the South Africa Development Fund in Boston, formerly known as the Fund for Free South Africa. Global Citizens Circle has been bringing people together in dialogue over current issues for over 40 years. People of different perspectives, ages, professions, all who have a vested interest and a commitment to resolve the pressing issues of the day have been brought together over those 40 years. There's a certain amount of magic in which these circles have evolved over the years in bringing people together who really are keen to learn from each other, listen, and engage each other. Today we have an amazing opportunity with an esteemed group of people, both panelists and in the audience, and globally. We have over 150 people here, at least half of whom are from all over the world, many who are Social Change Initiative fellows, and we're very glad to have them here with us as well. We thank our South African hosts and our South African guests who have also joined us today to partake in this incredible discussion today, Activism That Works. So the topic today that we really want to try to engage everyone is activism that works. Why is it pressing today? We have a current global climate, politically, economically, socially, that requires a new level of vigilance from all of us. It requires new levels of accountability of our own institutions that we've either helped elect or we're trying to transform. Why the US, South Africa, Northern Ireland? Well, Global Citizen Circle and the family has been involved in these three countries for many, many years, whether it's the peace process in Northern Ireland, anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, or issues of poverty, current pressing issues in the United States. These three countries also provide us with a lengthy history of activism, of social movements, and I think we can really learn from each other, from our histories, from our past struggles, and from our current struggles. So the three topics, the three issues, the three countries, and Global Citizen Circle come together in a really lovely and a unique way. We want today's discussion to be highly interactive as we possibly can. We really want it to kick off as a discussion. We want your participation. We invite the participation of our global audience through the Twitter feed. We really encourage what is a central tenet to Global Citizen Circle, which is to listen, to learn, and to engage. Where we build relationships with each other, we support each other, gently even challenge each other, and ultimately for us to all stay connected. So for us, this is the beginning of a dialogue that hopefully continues, and whether it continues in person or through the various social media platforms, we want that engagement and that dialogue to continue. The format for today is going to be pretty simple. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to open up with a short story about some of their work on activism, and then we're going to really get to the audience. I'm going to really ask people to keep their comments and their questions to under 2 minutes so we can try to facilitate as many questions and conversations among each other as we possibly can. We have three fantastic panelists here today. Phumeza Mlungwana, who's an SCI fellow, former General Secretary of the South Africa's Social Justice Coalition. Monica McWilliams, who's been a signatory to the Northern Ireland's Good Friday Peace Accords, and who's helped with peace negotiations in both Colombia and Syria. Opal Tometi, also an SCI fellow, Nigerian-American, and the Executive Director of Black Alliance for Just Immigration in the United States, and also a co-founder of the very vibrant Black Lives Matter movement. I want to kick off by asking Phumeza to...
It's a nice start.
Phumeza, if you would like to kick us off, tell us something in your work in which you've had to overcome you've had to overcome something, but that was a learning, a pausing moment for you in your activism that you feel comfortable sharing with us today.
Thank you, and welcome everyone who's here today. I
I think firstly I would be doing injustice if I wouldn't talk about the fact that in a democratic South Africa, from the 28th until today, my comrades from the SJC have been at the Equality Court fighting for a democratic police service to treat everyone in this country equally. And I think I'm proud to sit here in Khayelitsha, and comrades are continuing to say, in our democratic South Africa, we want to be as safe as everyone else, whether you're in a middle-class community or whether you're in a poor community. Which I think in that line, growing up in Khayelitsha, working in Khayelitsha, sometimes we don't define ourselves as activists. We define ourselves as trying to address a problem that affects us. And I think if I take a few years back in 2013, where we've seen a lot of cases of murder, of rape, of vigilante attacks, of xenophobia, and a lot of us working in the community were saying, well, we can't kill ourselves in the hands of amongst ourselves. We need a state that will be responsive to the challenges of the people. And I remember a lot of the cases that we followed of hate crimes, of rape and murder at the Khayelitsha Magistrate Court, which is just opposite the road. It was to say the criminal justice system must play its role, and it must ensure that there is justice for people that are corrupt of committing crime, but it must also offer justice for people that haven't committed crime. But I think for me, a very personal and challenging moment was when we had to talk about a question of strategy. Because if you follow a couple each case, you might follow 10 cases, the resources, the power, and the effort that is needed from the community is greater than trying to address the systematic challenges. And I think closer to 2012, 2013, when we said, actually, treatment action campaign, equal education, social justice coalition, are challenging crime, are challenging issues of safety that affects all of us. But how can we use the law to think about systematic ways of addressing crimes? And us moving from following specific cases to calling for a commission of inquiry, for me, was a powerful moment, because it was not only law experts or legal experts coming to say, this is what you need to do, but it was us who don't have a legal background, it was communities who don't understand how the law works, but saying, can we find a strategy that is going to make sure that the 5 cases we're following in Khayelitsha Magistrate Court are addressed, but any other case in Soweto, in Alexandra, in KZN, that people deal with the same challenges are addressed. And I think for me, the process of getting to choosing that strategy, but at the same time keeping the heart of the campaign on the people and ensuring that people that are affected also feel that whatever we get out of the process is going to address our community challenges. And I think that what motivates me as an activist and as a young person in all the work that I'm participating in.
Wonderful. Thank you, Phumeza. Monica, you come from Northern Ireland, a very different place from what you've seen here with lots of similarities. Can you share a little bit from your work that would enlighten us on some of these same issues?
Well, I love the idea about starting young. I was 16 and my sister, who's here with me, I think we were about 17 when we went to a meeting near our chapel in a rural area in County Derry. And we were signed up by a woman who is here today, Bernadette Devlin, as she was then, into the civil rights movement of Northern Ireland. And 16 years of age. I still have that little civil rights card, and I'm very proud of it. And so I cut my political teeth, I guess, at a very young age on the civil rights movement. But then realized it was quite a male movement. One man, one vote was a placard that I carried. And I hadn't thought it should have been one person, one vote. But that came later. And so eventually I got into the women's movement, a very, very important movement in Northern Ireland. It's cross-community, rural and urban, and very active from the bottom up. And so that was the late 70s and 80s. And by then I'd figured, and this is really important in terms of the story of social action, that we'd built a very strong network. And that was the first ingredient that led me to think, when the peace talks were declared after the ceasefires in 1994, I hope there will be some women at the table. We wrote to all the parties, we didn't get a response, and we thought, well, maybe we should do it ourselves. Our slogan, wave goodbye to dinosaurs. Didn't make us very popular, But we did say to some of the old-time politicians who were mad at us, is your name on that poster? No. Well, why are you self-identifying as a dinosaur? And why are you so mad at us? But it was a learning lesson. Because when we were given 6 weeks to get organized, but we had the networks. And if you have the networks in place and the activism in place, you can move real quickly. Without the money, without much resources, we managed to get elected. And we entered the peace talks in 1996. We were the only women at the table. But a big turning moment for me was entering the forum. It was called the Forum for Dialogue and Understanding. We renamed it the Forum for Monologue and Misunderstanding. Because that's all we were doing. Monologue, monologue, monologue. People with their own certainties, monologuing with people who had their own certainties. And so dialogue was our way forward. But my first introduction in that forum was to be told, shut up and sit down, you stupid woman. And it was public, and the wonderful Dunphy family were there to witness some of that. And it was only when some of the wonderful Dunphy family came up and said to me, that's appalling behavior. I then realized, this is appalling. This has to stop. So our transformation from conflict to peace isn't just about putting down the guns. It is also about the changing of attitudes towards women in our country. And that was the moment.
Thank you, Monica. Opal, you've come from the US, you've joined us here today, part of an incredibly vibrant, dispersed movement. Share with us a little bit about your experience and what you've had to share with us around some of these turning points in your experience.
So first of all, I just want to start by thanking everybody here. I'm just so grateful to even be in South Africa right now and be amongst such phenomenal comrades, peers, siblings in struggle. I'm really, really honored. And I know that there are many people here who could also speak to some of the struggles that we're all engaged in. And I'm glad that I can articulate a little bit of my own insight and a turning point for me in terms of the contributions that I was making in the shift. So as a co-founder of Black Lives Matter in particular, I had been engaged in racial justice and immigrant rights work for many, many years before coming to co-create Black Lives Matter online and then taking it to the streets and beyond. Many people would oftentimes ask me, what's your demand? What's next? What are you fighting for? How are you going to transform this vibrant kind of activism and all the mobilizations that are happening in the street to something meaningful? And I should back up and say a couple things. That one, Black Lives Matter came into being because an unarmed teenager was stalked and killed in his own neighborhood by a vigilante. So Trayvon Martin, 17 years old, in his own community, was stalked and murdered by George Zimmerman. And we all watched the court case, and we saw George Zimmerman be acquitted for this murder. And so many people across the country and across the world were watching, fixed to their televisions, this court case, and wondering, is this going to be the moment where Black people or this Black person was going to receive some sort of quote-unquote justice or some modicum of affirmation that his life mattered, that he existed, and that he was gone. And George Zimmerman was acquitted of this murder, and many, many people, thousands of people across the country took to the streets. We were shocked, we were outraged, we were in deep pain, and Black Lives Matter emerged as a rally call, a demand, a platform that was saying anti-Black racism is intolerable. And it's not just that it's happening by vigilantes. The killings aren't just happening by vigilantes. the problem is not just happening in the criminal justice system, but we see and we experience anti-Black racism in every sphere of our lives. And so when I came together with Alicia Garza, Patrice Colors, myself, and created, and purchased the domain name and all the other kind of social media tools, it was with the intention of calling to all of our awareness that anti-Black racism in every sphere of life needs to be addressed. So if it's in the immigration system, if it's in housing, if it's education, we need to be engaged in these struggles. And so that was the impetus. But for so many people, their understanding of what we were fighting for was wrapped up in a thinking that we were solely upset and outraged at this one murder, which we were. And then a year later, 2014, Mike Brown was murdered in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri. And once again, hundreds, thousands of people mobilized the streets in solidarity with the courageous people of Ferguson and said, enough is enough. We see you, we see what's going on, we see the militarized police force. And once again, we're stuck in a moment where we were calling for justice, but folks thought that justice was solely about a guilty verdict for Darren Wilson, the murderer of Mike Brown. And that was not it. It was much more profound than that. And so I share those examples to say that we created something that began to elevate the consciousness of the people, that began to raise awareness and call attention specifically to the ways in which structural racism is impacting our lives. But the real kind of decisive moment for myself and the people that I was working with, particularly because I'm based in New York, was when we decided that the awareness raising, the mobilization was not enough. That we needed to deepen our practice and develop a program of action that more people could be organized into. And so this looks like, specifically for us, we waged a campaign called Safety Beyond Policing, where we were looking at the ways in which our government was investing in our public safety net or not investing in it. So looking at the ways in which the education system was underfunded, housing, jobs for young people. And we were looking at quite literally the dollars and cents of it in comparison to the fact that the NYPD was about to get $94 million to hire 1,000 more police officers. And to us, that was unconscionable, given the fact that we were seeing such outrage at the types of killings in the street, and given the fact that there was just overwhelming awareness and just displeasure with the types of policing, the hyper-policing in our communities, it was unconscionable that we would have more police, right? And New York City in particular is actually the way that we're militarized in terms of our police, is the 7th largest police force in the world. And so we quite literally don't need any more. And we decided, enough is enough. Let's have a different type of conversation. Let's talk about the investments that our society is making and the value that they're placing on our lives. And that shifted everything for us. We engaged an amazing and vibrant coalition of immigrant rights groups, of Black Lives Matter New York City, Million Hoodies, Black Youth Project 100 local, and a number of other types of groups who saw the issue as impacting all of our lives, the quality of our lives. And to me, that was the decisive moment where we moved from awareness raising to a plan of action that included a variety of organizations who were self-determined.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Well done.
So I'm going to use my privilege as facilitator to ask the first question. Each of you shared a piece of your work in which you're looking at some sort of systematic change and up against some sort of systematic force. I'd like us to shift the conversation a little bit around what's the type of activism that's needed today to create or push for accountability and the systematic change that we're thinking about. And you've all come from a rich history of activism and doing different things, having different strategies. In 2017, going into 2018, with social media, with a whole bunch of other tools at our disposal, what is it that we're going to have to do to make activism work for today? So I'd like Phumeza for you to kick us off about what, in your vision, you think it's going to take for us to get to the systematic change that we're trying to get to.
Firstly, it's not Twitter or Facebook, but Twitter and Facebook might help us amplify what you're trying to say. I think to help activism be more effective is about us thinking, where do we want to go? And in my head, it's about ensuring that activists are aware why do we have these problems in the first place? Why are people without adequate sanitation? Why are our schools without the right infrastructure? How does that relate to money and politics? How does that relate to international policies or global policies that sort of drive how our governments think? But obviously you can't do that on the abstract. And I think what I think has built me also, and has built a lot of other comrades, is really investing in political education, is investing in education, activist education, because it doesn't only allow us to be able to go protest for that particular issue, it allows us to be able to link that issue with various other things. And I think if we're going to build mass movements, if we're going to build solidarities across continents and across communities, it is about people understanding why they have the issues, what are the issues, because everyone knows what the issues are, but how do those issues link with the broader issues? And I think there's so many examples of popular and political education which I think our movement should invest in. It might not see the results tomorrow, but I think the empowerment of activists themselves, and I think that's what we need to invest in. Whether that is a person that may go into government, or that is a person that may go and be in a philanthropy organization, or that may be a person who's going to continue working in community structures. But as long as they're empowered with information and knowing how they can use that, and whatever they do with that information, it's up to them. But as long as they have it, and I think that's the first part.
Right, thank you.
It's quite a long question for an Irish woman to answer in 2 minutes. I'll give it my best. I think the process is very important. For us in the peace negotiations, we felt that we needed to pay attention to the process. In most peace negotiations, the armed combatants are at the table, the old constitutional parties are at the table, but civic activists are rarely at the table. And we had a different system in Northern Ireland that was developed for the first two. And when the Women's Coalition saw the possibilities of getting through that window to be amongst the top 10 parties, and as I said earlier, with the networks in place, it was to say, okay, we've written enough about this. There's been enough scholarly papers, deeds, not words. Let's take the risk, and let's go out there and get inside. We were outsiders, there was no question about that. We were just ordinary women and some men, and we fell into quite extraordinary circumstances. I'd say we were accidental activists. We became politicians accidentally. And I'd said a prayer the night before the election that I wouldn't get elected. I think I'm probably the only person ever elected to say that, as were many of the other women. Because our idea of politics was something entirely different. And we had to make this a place where presence mattered. And it had to be inclusive. So I think the principles of inclusion stood us in good stead. The principles of human rights and equality. Those are the only 3 principles that we wrote all our policies around, and then asked members, if you feel you can sign up to those, then you can become part of this movement. We had cut our teeth, many of us, as I said, some of us in the civil rights movement, some in the trade union movement, many on the anti-apartheid movement. Good old Catarasmo had walked the streets of Belfast with us, and he I have to pay tribute to. And so he brought us into that movement. So we were learning from these other movements elsewhere, and the campaign for nuclear disarmament. But I would have to say that both the civil rights movement and the anti-apartheid movement had a huge influence on us as young women and young men. And then we became older and thought, how do we build on what came out of those? So process is important, but substance. What are you looking for? How do you get your interests on the table? If they're saying why, you say why not. And try and be innovative and creative and think outside the box. I think all of those things are important. And the curiosity of going and talking to people who don't always agree with you and building consensus, those were the hardest things to do. And then I learned a lesson, a big lesson. Because, you know, everybody talks about successes in these processes, but you learn from your mistakes. If I had to go back again, I wouldn't have just put aspirations into that peace agreement. I would have looked for guarantees. And so today, one of the reasons why we don't have your South African Bill of Rights is because it became an aspiration. And we brought Albie Sachs and we brought many of the South African individuals who were influential here to Northern Ireland to help us in this process, and they were enormously helpful. I remember Albie telling me that in South Africa there was as much dispute over a Bill of Rights, and some people thought it would be a bill for whites, which was really interesting. I said, well, that's something, but every time I write down Bill of Rights, it's almost as if I only get as far as Bill O, and then it becomes Bill of Rights, because the opposition were very opposed to the notion of human rights, either because of the legacy of civil rights or because they didn't understand that human rights were for everyone, just as you were explaining, and you were also. So that was a big lesson. How do you get strategic over this? And it was Martin O'Brien, who was working in Northern Ireland, in Belfast at the time, in the Committee for the Administration of Justice. We didn't have to dress him up as a woman and smuggle him into the peace talks. We almost did that. We did smuggle him in. And it was the expertise of civic society. These were the people on the ground who were working on human rights day and daily, and we needed to get that into the agreement. So again, it was both inclusion, it was looking at the interests, and Martin would agree the most difficult part of all of that has been the enforcement. And that's why civic activists are as much needed after a political settlement, as you know in South Africa, as they are whilst you're writing it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Monica. I just want to quickly remind people, Opal, just right before you go, that hashtag activism that works is the address where people can engage with us. So just wanted to put that reminder out once again. It's hashtag activism that works. Opal, please.
So I think this is an important question, and it's a large one, and kind of building off of what was shared in some of my remarks earlier, that moving beyond the awareness is just so critical. In the US, we've been able to elevate various statistics, various concerns, so many people know that every 28 hours an unarmed Black person is killed in the United States, or they know that over 40% of the imprisoned population is Black. And so we have this in our knowledge. We know some of the information around poverty rates, health disparities, and beyond. And what we are really struggling with, and what I think will help us achieve some of our aims, is institution building. And I think that's something that we're all committed to in some degree, and we can't take that for granted, that must happen, and that there is really no shortcut to doing the work of transforming our societies without that. Developing organizations that allow us to grapple with the issues of our day is paramount. And more than just the individual organizations, because we're in a larger context, we also have to develop mechanisms within our coalitions and our alliances to deal with the very real grievances and challenges that come up even within those formations. I just am reflecting on my time in the immigrant rights movement, in the larger racial justice struggle, and various other human rights spaces. And I see so often that we might have one campaign victory, but the reality is that we need ongoing spaces for us to achieve the wholesale transformation of our society that we all deserve. And the reality is that the material conditions that we are faced with, and particularly working at the grassroots level, the material conditions warrant a rigorous analysis, but a rigorous plan of action and a sustained plan of action. And that requires us doing the hard work of figuring out how we're going to struggle amongst ourselves. And I'm just sitting here reflecting on the fact that we have President Trump, Donald Trump, or 45, as many of us call him. And to me, there's a number of things, and we'll get into it. But to me, it just is a clear indication that we were trying to take too many shortcuts as a movement instead of grappling with the deeper issues of our time and developing, if it's political education and the day-to-day programs of action that educate people about their democracy, how to engage, how to champion for a living wage, how to champion for jobs, or whatever it might be. It demonstrates a disconnect between our programs and what was actually happening at the grassroots level. And so there's no shortcuts. No. We got to do the work.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for sharing kernels of what you've been thinking of, everything from the investing in political education so that our movements grow, to paying close attention to the processes, how you build strong institutions, but at the same time hold each other accountable and have mechanisms of internal struggle which are both respectful and ways that we grow. So you've put on the table, in terms of activism that works and activism that works today, some fascinating kernels. And we have a very diverse and very experienced audience with as much experience as all of us here on this panel. So I'd like to really open it up to questions, comments. I ask that you please stand, wait for the microphone, announce who you are and the organization, if you're with an organization, and ask your question or your comment, and try to please keep that to under 2 minutes. There'll be microphones moving around, so if you raise your hand, I will try to get to people. I will, in the interest of time and trying to get as many people as we possibly can, I'll go with trying to take about 3 questions at once, so that we can kind of cluster them and try to see who we want to get to answer it from here. I know it's not a shy group.
As you can see.
Yonela is my name. I come from an organization called Africa Unite. We're a human rights organization who work with young people. Now, my question is that as Africa Unite, we're a movement, as much as the Department of Social Development calls us an organization. But the question I have is that most of the other movements that I've been involved with over the years have somehow died as they continued their mission. No matter how legit was the mission, no matter how serious was it, but somehow along the way it somehow died. I don't know whether it was the mechanisms that we use or the type of engagement we had, but my question to the 2 of you, seeing that you are all involved in some sort of movements along the way, what is the key thing that you would say is very critical when one is involved in a movement, or the movement itself must hold dear so that it continues and achieves its mission or goals?
Okay, thank you.
Hello. My name is Saket Soni. I'm the founder of the New Orleans Worker Center that was formed after Hurricane Katrina made landfall, and I also run a national network of migrant workers. And my question is for Monica, and it's really inspired by a conversation I had with Bernadette over lunch, who is somewhere here. So Bernadette gets most of the credit for this question because she sparked it.
She can answer it then.
Yeah, right.
I guess, Monica, my question to you is what we can learn from peace processes. Those of us who are trying to do this work in one way or the other are working to renew democracy, whether it's around criminal justice issues or immigration. The broader end game is to have a democracy that's fully inclusive, that's deep enough for people to be involved and broad enough that all voices are heard. But renewing democracy seems harder now, particularly by the time you get to governance, the nation state ends up not being the steward of the economy. There's a global economy, there's climate change. There are forces that are stronger than nation states, and movements spend a lot of time getting to governance and then realize that there are things that are out of the power of the nation state. That leads to a great deal of conflict. And so it seems like there's something to learn from peace processes, not only about how to achieve peace, but how to reimagine, renew democracy. And I'm wondering if you can share from the Irish process, from perhaps the Colombian process, are there lessons that societies that are not necessarily in those kinds of open armed conflict, but are, nonetheless in a conflicted state on their way to democracy renewal, what can we learn from these peace processes?
Tough, yep.
One more. Like that.
Hi, my name is Axolile Nochwala. I'm Phumeza's successor from the Social Justice Coalition. My question was triggered when I came in the door, and it's often a conversation it's very difficult in spaces where I work with Dustin, who's white, who lives in the CBD, who can work in Khayelitsha, and I'm black, I work in Khayelitsha. And coming in, I made a comment to Fatima and Brad that this room is very white. And I'm interested in how, especially, the context, I think, in the US and in South Africa, when you talk about injustices and the inequality, especially race inequality, is similar, where one race is far less than the other. And I'll be interested in hearing maybe from Opal in terms of how these conversations go, where you have a struggle, a Black Lives Matter struggle, and you have white people who sometimes want to get involved. And I think this also speaks to the issue of race, and it speaks to the issue of gender, because sometimes I would say white people forget to introspect, and I would say sometimes as men we forget to introspect when we come to spaces where we're talking about issues of gender. So I'd be interested in hearing your views about that and the discussions that happen around these issues.
Great. Thank you for those questions. So let's take the first one, which is Phumeza. What do you think sustains movements? What are there critical pieces of movements that you think have a long-lasting effect, or things that we don't do that lead to them dying off? Do you have any thoughts on what helps us sustain movements?
I think if we had the answers, the ANC would still be alive, right? But I think that there's a couple of things, and I think all of us in this room are asking ourselves those questions, and it's going to take us a long time to agree on some of these. But I wanted to just put maybe 3 examples which I think we need to look at. Firstly, it's okay when you start organizing around the issue, and when that issue has been addressed, it's okay to not have a movement, right? And I think we should be open to that. But if you have an issue and you understand that it relates to bigger systematic challenges, then I think the process is about defining those systematic challenges and linking it. Because that's how you're going to try and make sure everyone is clear on the strategy. So I think it's a combination, and I'm not contradicting myself. And the second one is, I think with movement sometimes we forget that we are people ourselves, and we are individuals, and as individuals we play a particular role. And I'm touching on the negative part because sometimes, a lot of times, we romanticize our struggles. And as an individual, sometimes by being in those movements, we kill them. Either being on our strategy, either being on our thinking, and either be on how we think about building the right structures. And I think if you want to build a movement, it's about building the right internal structures. You can't speak about democracy and that democracy doesn't exist on the inside. But at the same time, organizing is about using different strategies. And I can tell you a lot of organizations in Cape Town use some strategies, and they're all different from each other. But there's also organizations that have been inspired by, over the years, for example, Abahlali Basemjondolo in KZN, and the way they organize inspires me as an organizer and challenges me to change how I think about things. And I think sometimes we're so fixed on doing things the same way we've done them, and we don't actually criticize ourselves. And sometimes when we move away from a strategy, it's not because that one has failed, but it's because you recognize that at this point, maybe it doesn't allow you to achieve what you want to achieve. So I think there's I'm focusing on the internal challenges, which I think often we always look on the outside, we always look at the political landscape, we always look on on how repressive the state is. But I think we need to look on the inside. We need to really look on the inside. We don't have to tell people about our dirty laundry, but we also need to actually sit and introspect as to what are the challenges that we have internally, so that we're very clear when we get and do our work. Those are just the 3. I won't have all of them.
One thank you. Monica, you alluded to getting involved at a young age. You've seen, you've lived through the Troubles, you've lived through the ceasefire, the signing of the agreement. You've seen movements go up and down. In your experience over that period, what would you say are some of the critical ingredients that sustain movements, sustain energy to move forward?
Well, the first thing I would say is it's okay to die off. It's absolutely, and the leaders should know when the moment comes rather than hold on and be bypassed. I think somebody in Zimbabwe has just learned that lesson. So it is really important to build an exit strategy, to know when you've done that piece. For instance, the Women's Coalition intended only to become involved in the peace talks. We did not want to stay any longer. And on the day of Good Friday, we said, well, that's it. We'll go home now and do what we do best, which is work in civic society. But in order to be part of the implementation of the peace agreement, you had to get elected to the Legislative Assembly for the next 5 years. And that's what we had to do, because we had been part of that agreement and we wanted to be part of making it work. And then we decommissioned ourselves. In Northern Ireland, they talk about decommissioning weapons. And I like the idea that the Women's Coalition was a little weapon for a little period of time, and then we decommissioned. And that was it. The women went back to their own policy-making bodies, into their communities, and were as influential as they were before. but in a different way. And I think that's really important to know that. And some of the bigger movements also moved. And I think, but in terms of what are the ingredients that sustain a movement, most definitely integrity, most definitely honesty, most definitely leadership that you can trust and that you're proud to stand alongside. And that notion of sharing out power and sharing with power is really important. Too many people go into it for the ego and to be famous for 5 or 10 minutes or whatever. And if you're in it for the long term, in fact, here I want to pay tribute to the Dumfries again. They worked in Northern Ireland under the radar. They stayed with us in the good times and the bad times, right throughout it all. And one of the most important things that they did was to connect us to others, to learn the lessons from other places, what works, what doesn't work. And I think when you're in a movement or an organization, as you've just said, it's really important to do that. What lessons can I learn? And champions are important as well. I want to tell you a wonderful story about South Africa in terms of the inspiration that we got in the mid-90s. We were looking at South Africa because there weren't very many processes. There was Guatemala and South Africa. And in Northern Ireland, we were looking and reading everything about your constitution, about the transition. What can we bring into it to ours? And then we had this most amazing invitation from President Mandela to come to Arniston on the Eastern Cape, to a military camp where we were locked up for 3 days. It was the best lock-up they ever did. And we sat down and we listened to the leaders here from all the parties. And we were told, you just have to listen. You don't have to take what we're saying and put it back into your own system. And we brought back many lessons. One was the sufficiency of consensus, the word I mentioned earlier. How do you build consensus across people who are so hurt and so harmed by the past? It's so difficult to do. In fact, we were so hurt and with so much hatred that we came in. Poor President Mandela and many of the, well, President Mandela in particular had to do his talk twice. And he said, and everything else had to be twice, 2 canteens, in the end 2 sets of men's toilets. This was in 1997, here in South Africa. He said, you people have brought apartheid back to South Africa. And that shamed us, and that made us think, we have to do this differently. And all of us came home and thought, well then the ceasefire, IRA declared a ceasefire about 2 nights later and came into the talks and stayed in the talks. And not many people know that South Africans came to us on many, many times, went into the prisons, went into the communities, shared their stories, and stories are so important. And we learned those lessons. And I think that's the importance that we learned, was also the determination of what happened here, the leadership that was offered here, the inclusiveness. And so I want to hold out that hope that South Africa one day will, again, it might be going through a terrible roller coaster at the moment, but one day will be that inspiration for the rest of the world.
Thank you. I haven't forgotten your question, so we'll get to it. But Opal, do you want to take a stab at this question around, the comrade asked the question about race and gender and how, you know, your thoughts, your perspectives on that?
So I like to remind people that Black Lives Matter started as a bit of a note on Facebook, actually. And although it's obviously morphed into a number of things, and now it's a network, but Black Lives Matter, sorry about that. It started as a love note to Black people that Alicia Garza wrote. And I think this is important because I want to remind us that so much of our power also lies in the ways in which we relate to each other and the ways in which we're able to consolidate and mobilize our own strengths to achieve the gains and the improvements in our society that we want. So I think that's, you know, kind of first and foremost and really important. But we obviously live in a society that's multiracial. In the US context, Black people are 14% of the population. We're obviously seeing all manner of repression and oppression in our society, and a legacy of enslavement and genocide, and so much else that has led to this particular moment that we're in. And it's important that we acknowledge the fact that, you know, no one is going anywhere right now. And that as we do our work in Black communities specifically, and as we're building power and reminding one another of our brilliance, of the strength in our culture, our resilience, and we're sewing into that, our allies, or people who are not Black, who are looking at us and looking at the courage that we're displaying and the ways in which that we're taking power and that we're shutting things down and, you know, we're engaged in all sorts of action, they're watching, they're seeing. And we've always had, you know, allies or accomplices that have co-labored, you know, alongside us. And it's important that they do that. And so in the work that we're engaged in the US, we're asking white people to really go into their own communities, work with their neighbors, work in their houses of worship, work across the dining table with their family members, and so on, and do the very important and critical education work with their own peers that allows for the types of injustices that we're experiencing in our society. We need white people to do the work with other white people. That is so critical. We didn't create this society how it is, right? We aren't oppressing ourselves. There is a particular class and race in the US context that is doing that. And so it's important that those people who benefit and have the privileges of being a part of that segment of society, they acknowledge that and they engage in the work with their own people. So that's one aspect of it. I oftentimes say it another way and talk about, you know, divesting from privilege, right? In whatever ways people can work to ensure that the benefits and the privileges that allow for power over communities of color or low-income people or other oppressed people in your society are decreased and diminished. The work that is so necessary right now is that of justice, of equity. And if we're not seeing that happen, and if people aren't willing to engage with the very real material benefits that they get because of the power dynamics in our society, you know, we'll continue to see this thing go on, time and time again. And we need folks to engage with systems of power. The issues that we're talking about aren't just interpersonal. It's not just one-to-one. It's structural. And so we need organized white people, white allies, dealing with these issues as well, just as courageously and fiercely and decisively as Black people and other communities of color. Relatedly, you know, you mentioned issues of gender, and particularly you were speaking to patriarchy, and you know, once again, systems and benefits that people get from their position, from their identity. And in our movements, and in particular with Black Lives Matter, we found it really important to acknowledge the fact that Black Lives Matter network was co-created by 3 Black women, which sometimes people don't know. And at first we kind of, you know, we didn't really think anything of it. We just, you know, we did this thing and, you know, we're part of this movement, and we have been organizing for 12, 15 plus years already, but we helped to create a particular type of intervention. And many of us took it for granted that, you know, we were who we were. However, many other Black women who came before us told us, no. People must know this history. People must know the significance and the importance of your particular contributions as Black women, and my 2 colleagues as queer Black women. how important it is to identify and name who it is that is part of the struggle, particularly because we've been doing this work for generations. We don't come into this work in a vacuum, right? Black women have always been architects in our movements, and we're finally living in a moment that is recognizing our contributions and naming it. And even in the midst of that, we're still plagued with living in a patriarchal society that oftentimes erases the contributions of women, the labor, and beyond those types of things, the very unique ways of being that allows our movements to be the way that they are. And one quick thing I want to know is that we frequently talk about our movement in the US as being very leaderful, and truly believe that. And I think so much of the reason we see our movements being characterized in that particular way in this period of our history is because it was co-founded and co-created by Black women. And there's something about our particular leadership style, our expression, our acknowledgement of the breadth of our needs, the breadth of our contributions, and the depth of our analysis that is required for us to deal with the very real issues of our day.
Great, thank you.
Keaton Sachs asked us a question.
Yes, we'll get to that in a second. But before we get to the Sachs question, I really want to take this opportunity to really thank Archbishop and the Archess both for joining us here today and really gracing us with your presence. It's a real honor, and thank you so much.
That's a pity, because I was going to say something about his leadership. I didn't realize he was going.
Behind, there's. Can you help?
Well, let's just.
Thank you, Bishop. Great to see you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate
so
it.
Clever.
It was great to see you again.
It was wonderful to have
You're wonderful people. Thank you.
We enjoyed it immensely, and it's just fantastic listening to.
So, Monica, to get to the question of, and I'd like your take on it, and maybe we can bring Bernadette into this conversation as well, which is the question of not just renewing democracy, but renewing democracy in a way that when you actually get in a position of governance, how is that juxtaposed when the economic conditions are not always under your control? So some thoughts about achieving governance, how we get there, being prepared to govern, but then also being prepared to deal with the economic conditions. One of the things I've always said, that in South Africa, just because we were fighting to govern, didn't mean we knew how to govern. And so often movements fail to take the time to understand what it means to govern. But then you add the complication that Sakat added, which is when you do govern and the economic conditions are not in your hands, how do you sort of reconcile those?
That's a really important question, because I've learned many lessons about the redistribution of power and what direction it tends to go for, and who benefits from a peace process. But in terms of Zach's question, I think it was New Orleans that gave us the wonderful slogan after your tsunami, nothing about us without us is for us. And we use that. And I think it's really important. Nothing about us, without us, is for us. And that, to me, was something that drove me from civic society into a more formal political realm, from the small p to the big P. And when I look at this issue of power, most of my experience has been working on the household level in terms of intimate partner violence, and there's a lot of power there that is invisible and needs to be made visible. And then you move to the national, or regional, national, and global. And you asked about Colombia, and we didn't, although we had the world's attention on us, we didn't have the geopolitics of Syria or Colombia. We had, of course, the influence of the European Union. With Brexit now, that has become a worry. Not for me, I wish Brexit would go away somewhere, but it's the geopolitics of that is going to have a huge impact on our peace process. So we should never forget about the bigger geopolitical picture. And of course, for Syria, that's huge. And for Colombia, I've been more involved in the Colombian peace process, and there is a huge issue about the redistribution of resources after a peace settlement. You know, the farmers were growing cocoa, which was the drugs. You just can't bomb that from the air, which we were trying to do. What's the alternative in terms of land distribution, alternative farming? And they were smart enough to put that into the peace agreement. And it was because that peace agreement was more inclusive. And they even had a gender subcommission in Havana where they got many issues. And because wars do different things to men and women, and the gender-specific harms, all of those were on the table. So I think that's really important in terms of looking at the redistribution of resources. But that, for me, is the hardest thing of all in the enforcement of a peace agreement. The first thing that happens in a peace agreement is the distribution of governance power. That's the first thing. Now, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. For us at the minute, it's not working, but they'll have to get through that. Justice is as important, but of course they pay and spend a lot of attention on security sector reform, on police reform, multi-million pounds, and don't actually look at the other aspects that create justice from the bottom up, which is about human rights. It is about equality and equal opportunity. And Bishop Tutu has just left us, but he came to Northern Ireland to talk about the big issue of victims, victim reparations and reconciliation. But the final ingredient of this is economic opportunity. Who benefits from the peace dividend? And every country that I've visited, that's the biggest question. And it's the hardest of all. And that's also where you need other countries to come and help. And that's where the geopolitics comes in. The international community stepping up. In Northern Ireland, we had €2 billion of funding. Not every peace process gets that. By the way, as a result, if it was only funding, we should be the success story of the world. It shows you that throwing money at it will not necessarily resolve it. But it was really important that civic society got involved, and much of that also helped with community development. But in terms of that question of economic power, at the moment I'm on a commission to disband paramilitaries, 20 years after peace agreement. Now, half of the people in the country think that the only way to disband them is to lock them up, throw away the key, or military response, criminal justice response. It isn't going to work. No police service is ever going to do that on its own. No courts are ever going to do it. So what is the issue that they're still there? And they are mostly men, mostly the old armed patriarchy, and mostly male pale and steel, and calling themselves commanders and brigadiers. And so it's the usual issue in terms of how do you transform that, where they think they're needed and the community say, no, you're not. The coercive control, extortion, criminality, and gangsterism. And I think South Africa have a lot to teach us around that transition. But why did they not think that they were part of our peace process, that they're still around? And that's about making sure the next generation neither romanticize what went before, but benefit. And that's the trip down in terms of sustainable peace, about education, about training, about jobs, about giving those young people the opportunity in their own country instead of having to emigrate and go somewhere else. And that is, to me, the hardest of all. And I'm still at it. It's an unfinished business. But everybody does it differently. And I think those four pieces of power that I've learned, unless they're all working household, regional, national, geopolitical, and the global, making the local and the global work together.
If we can get a microphone to maybe Bernadette, if you wanted to, sort of since.
Thank you. Wasn't sure if I was getting the credit or the blame for that, for that question. I think the issue for me, and going back to pull it together and some of the other questions that are asked, is we start off with an issue, and something sparks off a collective response. And before we know where we are, we have a movement. And then immediately following on that movement, we have a resistance to the progress, and we have a conflict. And depending on how a lot of other factors of our culture, our history, the depth of the conflict, the linking points, we can be into a struggle that is or is not armed. And then, no matter how long it goes on, it ends up with some kind of resolution, some kind of accommodation. But I think the thing that I see in Northern Ireland, I see in South Africa, I see in Colombia, I see in Nicaragua, I saw everywhere. And going back to then how we understand strategy, I ask myself, how is this happening? And to me, one of the things that causes it to happen is that many of us who are human rights activists, our human rights activism has its origin and understanding and framework within the United Nations Convention of Human Rights. And the one area where the United Nations of Human Rights continues to be weak is in the social and in that social and economic rights are human rights. And so we have human rights, which are social rights, political rights, gender rights, but social economic rights are still framed in a very, very different framework. So when we come to resolving conflict, and when we come to building movements, the thing that we don't start in the building of the movement is understanding the social and economic strategies and the social and economic infrastructures that feed our divisions. And yet we see them. We see that the people who are most oppositional on the ground to black people having equal economic rights are poor white people. You say, well, where's mine? The people who are most resistant to the inclusion of migrant labour, of refugees, of asylum seekers, are people who say we've got homeless of our own. But there's no building in the movement that teaches us to understand our own homelessness in the context of the homelessness of others, which goes very much to your point of educating in our own environment. And so when we get, I tell you two very short stories. My son, who is an economist and works alongside me in that he says, I actually generate resources and my mother spends them. But it's not that simple. But when he was 9 years of age, I was at a meeting and I couldn't find childcare, so I had to take him with me. So this 9-year-old is sitting, saying nothing and watching. But when we were going home, he said, Mum, just in case you won, do any of you know how to run a country? And I had to say, no. And with the wisdom of a child, he said, well, I would make sure somebody knows how to run it before you win. And we miss that point. So we get to the point that we do all the bits, and then we borrow the economic strategy from somebody who thinks they know more than us. And you know what they know more than us? How to ensure whatever we win, we do not get our hands on the means of production of wealth. That we do not get our hands collectively on the means of distribution of resources. And so our leadership gets into governance. And the first thing they have to be is responsible and recognize that the purse isn't full and that resources are finite. And we have all bought into the narrative that there isn't really enough to go around, so we must be creative. We live in a world of abundance. There are resources. So when people say, let's be clever, there's not enough, we have to be creative, I tell you, the best way to be creative is to say and understand that 1% of the human beings in the world own and control 50% of the wealth and resources. And the other 99% are trying to exist within the other 50%. So a good inclusive conversation would be, could somebody explain to me why the 1% have the bigger stomachs? Do they eat more dinners? Is there an infinite expense on their education? Do they need more houses? Or is there not a possibility that the democratization of wealth should be on the peace process table? So that when we're having that conversation, in order to have the peace, we're not borrowing from IMF and economic strategy, but we're saying if we are to resource the peace building and the continuity of the peace, what will the people who already have more than enough contribute to the public purse? And then we don't have a conversation like we do have in Northern Ireland. The first thing that the responsible Sinn Féin had to do was reduce corporation tax from 28% to 10%, rather than put it up to 35%, because Apple has more money than me.
Thank you. So if we could get some more questions, and I just want to remind people that we've sort of hit the 1 hour mark. So in order to get, as many questions and feedback as possible, brevity is our friend. So let's go over here first.
Hello, I'm Charlene. I'm Charlene Carruthers. I'm the National Director of BYP 100. We organize young black people across the U.S. And I wanted to comment on and build on what some of the things that Opal and Monica shared around people who are left out of the conversation and even how we tell the story. So it's important to know that Black Lives Matter, the network, the platform, was co-created by 3 black women, including 2 black women who are queer. It's important to have women at the table in the peace talks. The intervention that is as important that is happening in the US right now is also centered in the stories of how black women, queer and trans people are criminalized, policed, and experience violence at the hands of the state and also interpersonal violence. That is a huge characteristic of our movement right now. And what that looks like is just as important as the story of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown have been, so is the story of young black women like Rekia Boyd have been to our movement in mobilizing people across the country, right? Where I sat in a courtroom with Rekia Boyd's mom during the court case of the police officer who killed her, Dante Servin, and she sat next to me in both her grief and her resilience, and she said, they never talk about black women and girls. They never talk about how police kill us, how police rape us, how police violate us. And then about a month later, we had a National Day of Action focusing on ending state violence against black women and girls and femmes that included the Black Lives Matter Network, Ferguson Action, BYP 100, several organizations across the country. We were in well over a dozen cities. And for us, that was a key intervention in saying we have to broaden our analysis of what state violence looks like to include black women and girls. And also, when we talk about black women, we mean all black women. We mean black women who are transgender. We mean black women who are incarcerated, black women who are domestic workers, all black women who are migrants and immigrants. And that is imperative if we're talking about activism right now. Like in our work in black organizing, in left radical black organizing, yes, it is about anti-black racism, and it has a deep gendered analysis that is rooted in radical black feminist movements, right? So we talk about the civil rights movement. Just as important to that has been the black feminist movement and the radical sectors of the LGBTQ movement in the US. So Marsha P. Johnson, a black trans woman. So I would be remiss if we had this whole conversation about movement in the US and didn't build on what Opal started around, yeah, it's about young black men and boys, and we are doing critical interventions, critical work around ending patriarchy and all of its cousins, transphobia, homophobia, and that's like, it's critical for us to move on our growing edges. That's what Patrisse Cullors would always talk about. What are our growing edges in movement? And I implore everybody to think about that. Who's not at the table? If it's Fannie Lou Hamer would say all of us or none of us, and even as black people, we're not homogenous.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. My name is Wiseman Pepo. I'm a social activist based here in Khayelitsha. I just have, 2 questions. I will be short. The first question is to the panel is, how do we actually champion the issue of party politics within the spaces of activism? Because you'll find that I call myself an activist, a social activist, but then I'm still, a loyal member of African National Congress. And at the same time, when I want to address an issue, then I have to make, a government of African National Congress. Then it becomes an issue now because I can't address that issue, vocally as if I don't belong to that certain political party. So I think that question, if the panel can answer that question, maybe can, give an idea to us as activists on how do we position ourselves within those spaces. And the next question is that in relation to activist that works, how do we then address the issue of classism? Class in this space and in relation to the hashtag activists that work. Because you'll find even here, there's a working class, there's a middle class, and now for a person, sometimes you already, see that sense of inequality within the space, and as activists, it shouldn't be like that. So how do we deal with that? Because when I'm an activist and still see myself as a working class, someone who don't have any means of production, and you as a person who is being above me in terms of economic aspect and position, it means that for me as an activist, I cannot express myself fully as you can. So I think it's just those 2 questions. I don't want to dwell more, but the issue of classism in relation to the topic that activists that works, and the question of party politics, how do we deal with that in the spaces of activists? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, Yonela is the name from Africa Unite. I think one of the key things that worries me, and I'm worried right now, is the issue around democracy and constitutionalism, peace and justice. Monica somehow alluded in the issue of someone who left government a few days ago, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. One of the key things that we were discussing with my friends across the continent is the worry that we carry. There are 2 worries in particular. One of them is that in the continent, we are the richest continent, if I can put it like that. But yet we have the poorest population in the world. And that worries us. And part of the reasons, personally, I was somehow rooting for Mugabe and not rooting for him at the same time, was the issue to say there was a kind of mindset of a pan-Africanist mindset in him to say, we have to look at the issues that are quite critical for the continent for us to be able to move forward, no matter how we implemented it. For instance, the Teresa of Britain just said, I think one of the mistakes of Zimbabwe invested too much in education, which is quite incorrect to say. So we are looking at the issues of pan-Africanist mindset, or in the mindset that says, how do we, as a continent that is rich, find a way to make our people richer? But now the issue is that we are looking at Kenya, we're looking at South Sudan, we're looking at DRC, we're looking at all these countries. When we look at the perspective of putting the goggles of democracy, constitutionalism, peace, justice, it looks rather vague to imagine if in the future of such things. It worries me quite a lot. And I'm looking at it in the context of young people. How do we find a way, or how do we develop mechanisms that ensures these, these key drivers of a society that people can be they can have that ability to self-determine or self-determination. We're looking at such countries, perhaps another question would be, so how do we get into a space? I'm in South Africa, but there's an issue in Kenya. I have that distance issue. Looking at the issue of West Papua as well, where with such issues where people are being forced not to be able to have their human rights. I just want to your comments on those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the questions, Phumeza, maybe you want to take a stab at. How do you position yourselves in as an activist, but then there's also political structures in which, one of our participants is sort of talking about that internal tension. What's your response to that?
I think my position, I shouldn't have sat next to you. I should have sat a little way down because all the questions start with me now. But I think, Wiseman, you're raising a very important question, which I might not have the answers now because that's actually one of the questions that Dustin and myself are trying to think about. In our context, we do feel like in a way we've ignored our role in the electoral politics, and there's great reasons why we did that. And I think it has been useful to organize beyond political identity, in the context of Cape Town, organizing people that either they're DA or they're ANC, but not talking about their political identity, but talking about the issues. That has a lot of benefits. It has a lot of benefits also of pushing struggles. For example, the Premier of the Western Cape being able to respond better because she thinks the people of Khayelitsha are trying to embarrass her because Khayelitsha is an ANC constituency, and vice versa with the ANC. So there are opportunities when we don't align ourselves with political parties. But I think the very important question that we're asking ourselves is how do we engage with that space? Even if we don't identify with a particular political party, but how do we engage with that space? Because it has a lot of power. I think many people are going to remember now there was a vote of confidence earlier in the year. And there was a lot of mobilization on trying to say we want Jacob Zuma removed. Because we know why he should be removed, not because we don't agree with the ANC or whatsoever. But the power we had in getting him removed, we didn't have that. And these are the questions we're starting to ask ourselves is how do we position ourselves? There's different organizations with there's different examples we can learn from. Personally, I don't think if we form another political party and contest elections, we're necessarily going to address the problems. Another question is how do we engage with all the current political parties that are in parliament now? And the nature of us being adversarial may change. Another question is we know that the whole electoral system itself is a problem. But what are we doing in order to try and push for a lot more accountability, a lot of participatory democracy in the whole system? So there's a lot of these questions that I think they're difficult, but I think we don't have a choice. We have to think about these questions, and we need to try and find ways to break through. There's organizations that currently in Joburg that I've met through the work that is currently done on urban land. They're using their alliance with the ruling party in very strategic ways. And what can we learn from that? And personally, from where I'm from, and I think Wiseman, you know this, we have like divorced ourselves completely from aligning with any political party. But I think it's about time we look beyond that. There's different examples. A lot of these examples have different shortcomings. They're not one answer fits all. And we need to find one that fits the South African context, because currently 2019 is coming, 20th of December is coming, and some of us are outside the room where the decision of the ANC is going to be made. And some of us don't practically care whether it's Cyril Ramaphosa or Nkosazana Zuma that comes out, because we know who one of the two is not going to deal with the problems that we have. And these are the questions we must start to engage in. This is the political engagement we need in our own movements. Our own movements of toilet, of education, of poverty. They need to talk about the politics of the country. They need to talk about how we contribute to the broader political discourse. And I think they're all difficult, but I think we have I'm confident that we do have the ability to actually be very strategic in terms of how we use our power, because we have it. And we've seen in terms of all the work that we've done, we actually have our power. We just need to use it in ways that speak to the broader political questions. Hopefully we're not going to have an ANC in 2019, but hopefully we'll have political parties, whether be DA or EFF, that think differently about social movement, that think differently about poor communities. Because currently we have a lot of protests, but they don't care what we're saying from the outside, because they can decide whether they want to respond to the calls of poor communities or not. And I think that's where we need to come from. And I think it's a long debate that we need to have, but these are questions we actually have to unpack.
Thank you. There's a question of, so there's also a question of how you deal with internal issues around class. Opal, do you want to take a quick stab at how this has come up with your work and in some of the work you've been doing? So just a quick snippet on some of your thinking on that.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that this question is paramount. I was sharing with some folks yesterday that the elephant in so many of our rooms is global capitalism and how it's not working, and how it leaves so many of us quite literally in squalor. And the work that I do with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration is largely situated around much of this question, working with both African Americans in the United States, but also with Black immigrants from Africa, the Caribbean, different parts of the Americas, and so on. And we're stuck in a place where we know that despite whether or not you are formally, a citizen of a country, that isn't sufficient, right? You aren't guaranteed maybe a living wage or even a minimum wage in some cases. The benefits that one might expect or should expect of their government, of their society, just don't exist. And so there were some comments that were raised earlier that got me thinking. I think particularly, Bernadette, you mentioned abundance. And I just believe we actually have to flesh that out and remind ourselves of what truly exists in this world and what also exists within each of us, the creativity, the ability to fashion new economies and new ways of relating to one another, where we say, no one actually has to be homeless. Like it's actually, it's not tolerable, and we can't maintain the status quo as though it's okay. It just isn't. Similarly, Charlene mentioned, what are some of the edges that we're pushing up against? People should not be, we say undocumented in the US, or this notion that human beings can be quote unquote illegal, right? It's disgusting, it's deplorable. And I know for myself, and I'm sure for everybody in this room, we don't want to live in a world where people can be seen as such and that will be okay, and we operate as a society as though there's a class of people that don't belong, and quite literally their existence is criminalized in so many ways. And as a result, you can see things in the US. We're seeing people being actively stripped of their immigration status, and we have 11 million, if not more now, undocumented immigrants in the United States. And that's intentional. We have systems that won't operate if people were to be formally brought into the economy, or if they were to also have a situation where they were able to stay in their own home countries, right? Because of the ways in which the global economy is set up, the way in which global capitalism and economic globalization is impacting people all across the world. And so people quite literally aren't able to stay in their homes. I'd really be remiss if I didn't mention what's going on in Libya right now, which I think so many of us are thinking about, are watching. Thankfully CNN covered it, but it's been going on for years, right? Quite literally for years. African migrants being enslaved in Libya. And it's a hard thing to talk about, because we know it's been going on for a long time. We know that there's finally this moment where people are grappling with what it looks like to live in a day and age where the enslavement of people could be occurring, and it has been on beyond what's going on in Libya. But it's largely because people are not able to survive in their countries of origin. They aren't able. They are forced to move. They're forced into precarious work situations. They're forced to make these really grueling and horrific journeys. And many people lose life, limb, and so on. And so we have the situation where Libya can be occurring right now in this day and age, and everybody knows. And we have to, I think, as people understand the kind of slippery slope and the trajectory that our world is on that allows for something like that to go on for years and years and years.
Monica, one of the things that struck me over my trips to Northern Ireland over the years, there's different ways to cut the tensions in Northern Ireland. Class is clearly one that's very prominent. In your experience, what has been a way in Northern Ireland where the voice of the working class has been incorporated or remiss, or attempts at incorporating it into moving forward for a vision for what a future Northern Ireland should look like?
It's really important question, this question of class. And actually the two main parties in Northern Ireland at the moment, the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin, would see themselves as predominantly the party of the working class. The previous party was seen as the party of big houses. And yet the question is, how much did they retain the status quo when they had the opportunity to do things differently? It's different in Northern Ireland than South Africa. From what I hear and have seen in South Africa over the times I've been here and read, is there was a lot of incorporation of civic society into the ANC and into the parliament, both from the trade union movement and from many of the NGO community, in terms of taking the leadership of that. And to me, it's kind of sad because they're much needed where they were. And in Northern Ireland, that didn't happen. In fact, quite the opposite happened. We made a proposal in the Civic Forum to have the voice of civic society advise the legislative body on social, economic, and cultural issues, because I saw the richness of civic society with its working class participation. It's chaotic, it's messy, but it's rich and diverse, and it's pluralist. And so when we proposed the Civic Forum, we proposed that the voices we don't often hear of, because it's always Protestant, Catholic, British, Irish, Unionist, Republican, and we said, look, there are disabled people, there are children, there are ex-prisoners, there are victims, there's a whole diverse opinion here, ethnic minorities in particular who are, and we do have issues where you have sexism, you will have sectarianism, you have racism. And those are the issues that were needed to be tackled in the transformation. It was stood down and abolished. It's in the peace agreement. So we did not do what South Africa did, and civic society has stayed outside, but has remained very constructive. Menina is here, Menina O'Prey, who has been greatly involved in a social justice initiative. Actually, those two words are very interesting. Because human rights became so contested in Northern Ireland, it was turned into these words, social justice, because it meant something to the working class, more than the words perhaps human rights. Because if anybody knows how to exercise their rights, it's the educated and the litigious. And often it's those who don't have them, who need them most. And I took a great deal of encouragement from those social injustice initiatives that were very inclusive of the hard-to-reach communities. To the man at the back, I think I'm very taken by two things here. One is how many young people here are involved in these discussions. I don't see that so much at home. They've switched off, they've become cynical, they see no value in this kind of forum and participation and dialogue. So I take my hat off to you, and I take my hat off to you for asking that question. Because we need to hear your voice. Your presence is important, your story is important. The women I work with are predominantly working class women who have endured terrible lives. And it's their stories I collect. And if I didn't have their experience turned into expertise, then the resources and the good services that need to be put in place wouldn't be there. So that's my story back to your story, is that it's so important that you stand up, that you articulate, that your interests are met. And we face the same issue. My job now is with the next generation in terms of this disbandment issue. And to me, it's a process. It's not an event. And it's about giving that next generation the opportunities. My own sons have left the country. I fought all my life to try and change the country so they would stay. They have become so switched off by what they've seen that they said, we're out of here. Both because of jobs. One of them couldn't get it, and the other because he was so sick of what was passing as normalization. And that's the kind of thing that I will continue to my dying day to try and change. But the kind of message that I'm really saying is that you don't have to always be inside the political party. You can do as much from outside in terms of political and civic activism. And the final thing I want to say is something else I took from South Africa is your constitutional court and your activism on human rights. Nobody really knew how that court was going to pan out, how the importance of it was. Kate O'Regan, I hope I've got her name right, one of the justices in the Constitutional Court, was in Belfast on Friday night and gave a talk, and I went to hear it, and her question was, Constitutional Court, almost 20 years after, a success or a disappointment? And she came down in the end of it, of course, that it has been a success. And that's where, for me, the judiciary are so important to sit alongside an executive, to be independent, and to give that voice to where human rights can make a difference. And here in South Africa, as Bernadette said, you've taught us a lesson of how it wasn't rocket science to put social and economic rights alongside political and civil rights. Of course, at the end of the day, you will ask the question, and what difference did it make on the ground? But at least you've got the seeds and the foundation to build on.
So, thoughts, questions, insights from, and I just, we have about.
In the UK, and my question is very quick and simple, I promise. I'm just, because the work that you guys all do is incredible, and actually it's quite inspirational for me, and a lot of things that I'll be taking back to the UK. And I just want to know how, I suppose you guys, what have you put in place to overcome your barriers and your struggles that you're currently facing? I suppose that's the question that I just want to know. Thank you.
Good question.
Okay. My name is Mosuli. I'm from Mlungwana in Mind and Labour Community Media from Forum. I wanted to talk about building movement because it's a very interesting subject because many movements collapse because of sustainability. What I think is, a movement can only be built if it has a legit struggle. For example, you cannot say you can collapse TAC because you've got treatment, because they also have a duty to fix the broken system within the health system. You cannot say you collapse, for example, equal education, but they also have a duty to monitor the education system that is not adequate for our people, where there's no computer labs and everything within the school system. Also, the other thing that I wanted to talk about is when we talk about mobilization, we're saying we need to mobilize community, we need to mobilize activists, but also we understand how the state is brutal to our own people. I think this is the other thing that we need to look as the people who advocate for democracy and as the people who uplift the constitutionalism, Yonela, on that part. Also, the other thing, lastly, we experience it even to Rosma's fall. Students were mobilized. They were struggling and advocating for legit struggle. But we know how the police respond. So these are the critical things that we need to look as an activist, rather than to sit back, because we also know that freedom and democracy is not for the privileged. It's for everyone. Every citizen must enjoy freedom, must enjoy democracy freely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So there was a question directed at you that was that probably we don't have enough time for, because it's probably an entire session on its own. But if you want to take just a slice of that around the role of constitutionalism and sort of how it impacts us, but just keep it tight and short, because there's no way we're going to get an answer that's going to meet that entire question.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to be as brief. I wish Yanela could have asked that question. It was going to be much more clearer to me as compared to it being read. I think when it comes to constitutionalism, a lot of people who know me, I'm very wary of throwing terms, and I'm very wary of using theories to explain our struggles. I'm rather a person who wants to understand our struggles and maybe use theory to explain them a little bit better. But if we talk about constitutionalism the way we all speak about, personally, I'm grateful in our current context that we have a constitution that speaks to all the rights that we should have as South Africans, that speaks to all the human basic rights. The question of whether they are made real or not is a second question, which we're trying to advance. And I feel like in our context, a lot of the work that we're doing, we already have a foundation to advocate from. And again, we're fortunate for now that we still have courts that are very efficient in enforcing our constitutional rights. And so that balance for me is one of the tools that we have as activists. But I think it's also a balance that we need to be aware of, because the more we use it often, the more we abuse it, the more we're going to kill it at the same time. We've seen how our ANC government has targeted the key independent institutions because of the very same role they have in advancing our constitutional rights. So in a way, as a document and as a vision, I'm still a constitutional baby, because I was born in 1989, and that's all I know. And I think secondly, there was a question around the continent. And I think this is I wasn't sure what the question was asking, but I've realized that as South Africans, we're very arrogant about our position in the continent. We're very arrogant in where we are as a country. We're very confident around how far we've come. And so a lot of our struggles aren't located in the whole continent. They are all South African. And I think that's where we need to change, because if we're talking about broader global politics and policies and political economy, we can't do it as South Africa in isolation. We need to talk about the whole continent. And I think I've been inspired to hear over the past week about how activists that are even in high school, how they engage on what is happening in Zimbabwe, and the in-depth discussions that they're having around what's happening in Zimbabwe, in Uganda, sometimes a lot of people working on LGBTI rights and how they make us understand some of these issues. And I think as South Africans, specifically, we haven't done a lot of that. A lot of people, when you engage with activists from outside South Africa, they actually have a good sense of what's happening in our country, but we're not paying that in return. And I think there needs to be a combination of the different relationships in building that.
That's right. Yes, South Africans haven't been very reciprocal with other struggles historically. And I think we need to be much better about that.
With ours, you were pretty good.
No, I want to just elevate a couple things related to Pan-Africanism. I didn't quite also grasp the question, but I just, I look at some of what is taking place on the continent in terms of emergent networks that are Pan-African in nature, and I'm in awe. I'm in awe given the different languages that are spoken, given the technologies, infrastructure, and so on, and I'm looking to different networks such as the PACJA, so looking at the ways in which this Alliance for Climate Justice is mobilizing people all across the continent, acknowledging the fact that 6 of the most acutely impacted countries by climate change are on the continent, of the top 10, are right here on the continent. So taking the types of courageous stances and developing leadership that is continent-wide, I think is so, so important. And I just want to, elevate that network as one of the vehicles and places where I see that occurring. I also am thinking about an international network that Baji is a part of called the Pan-African Network in Defense of Migrant Rights, which is also largely based on the continent, but there are a few other organizations that are situated in Europe and in the US that are also grappling with this question around the rights of migrants, of Black migrants in particular. And so they're beginning to develop their own response to what's happening in Libya that is African-centric and relies on the leadership and the cultural nuances of folks here. And just acknowledging the fact that they've been dealing with anti-Black racism in North Africa for generations. Right. And then, of course, Femnet. I think about African feminists and just the vibrant network that they've created. And I just want to elevate those as just key kind of Pan-African networks that are developing and amplifying the needs of grassroots communities that I think is just really important in this conversation.
Can I address the question of barriers?
Yes.
I think that's a really important question to ask, both on a personal level and a systemic level. The most important thing I'd say at a personal level is none of us can do this alone. You need a good team around you. You need a support network around you. Not only because if you break a leg, you need to pass it on, but also because there will be so many days when you will be, like I was, told to shut up and sit down or to get out of the kitchen, go back to the kitchen or whatever. And you need people to encourage you. In Ireland, we weren't very good at this. When Americans used to say to me, "That's a lovely dress," I used to say, "That old thing? Sure, I got that for nothing." And then I learned to say, "Why, thank you." Because that was a compliment, and I had been brought up in a culture where you kind of didn't, well, you certainly didn't praise yourself, and you couldn't even take praise from anybody else. So for me, culture, cash, confidence, and custom were the 4 barriers that we faced in our activism. And Tito was telling me something about what he did in relation to him as a man. I watched this film in a maze. Maybe you were describing yourself as a constitutional baby. I love that idea. I was probably a negotiation novice, but you learn these things. And so maybe had some success because people gave to us, we're now giving back to others. But I think that the biggest and most difficult challenge of all our lives is the changing of attitudes, changing of those norms. And it's an unfinished business. But that's what social activism is really about, leaving that legacy. Not only are we to be strategic, change those laws that were so discriminatory, change those laws that were so unfair and corrupt, and change those policies that weren't about redistribution, But that is very much the big systemic stuff. Very much at the personal level. It's from every one of us, but it's also the influence that we leave, the legacy we leave. Did you actually, in the end, manage to change a critical mass of attitudes? So the country that you're living in is a better one than you came into.
Great. Thank you. I also understand the question that was back there about brutality and more broadly repression. And I think it's one we're all grappling with around state repression, whether it's economic, whether it's violent, whether it's police. And I think all our panelists here have sort of alluded to some of these questions of repression. And I think it continues to be one of these themes that have come out around having not just democratic institutions, but how do we continuously figure out ways to hold our institutions accountable. And that becomes the sort of central piece of what we're trying to do, and continuously try to report and expose whatever repression and brutality that continues. And so I think that without sort of trying to get through the answers here, I think it's also been a theme about how we continue to be vigilant around those issues of repression.
Can I just say one quick thing
quickly.
to that? So in the U.S., we've been, our movements have been they've been criminalized, they've been demonized, and so on. And the latest thing to happen is coming out of the administration. The FBI has been surveilling us, and they've now created this term called Black Identity Extremists. BIE, Black Identity. So for the fact that we have the audacity to say being black is not a crime, or for the fact that we have the audacity to organize and to demand our rights and to demand justice, we are now being characterized as a problem, which is, is not new. It's not new.
Subversives.
We've seen this before.
Radicals.
Right? Radicals, all of these things. But the state has now said they're such a threat that we're going to systematically begin this program that will allow us to effectively, deem them as a threat, right? Like almost like a terrorist threat, a threat to our national security. And so I just want to, I want to raise it in this space just because the more we, assert ourselves, the more we're able to capture the imagination and change hearts and minds and so on, the more those who are in power and who are okay with the status quo begin to devise or refine their methodologies that'll allow them to repress us and suppress us. And I just want us to be mindful of the morphing of that, and remind allies and folks who are co-conspirators in this movement to stay vigilant for the ways in which the state morphs to deal with us, people that they see as a threat. Right. It's happening with this kind of federal level, but it's also happening at the local level. There are new laws that are criminalizing protests. They're calling some of our tactics, they're calling us economic terrorists. That's the label that's being used. And then there are also these other, laws and different proposals that are under this umbrella called like the Blue Lives Matter bills. And so, meaning police, right? Law enforcement lives matter. Yeah. And it just is used to obscure what is really going on, the conversation that we're trying to have, and the types of programmatic shifts and cultural change that we know needs to happen. But there are these emerging, laws, policies, and different things that are happening at the same time that just really cause a lot of confusion, and they distract, and they ultimately undermine our movements. And so I just want us, as a community, to understand the ways in which repression is morphing and is being codified as well in the name of national security.
We have a little bit of time to take a few more comments and questions, and then we can sort of wrap it up.
So my name is Nadine Hack. I'm one of the organizers of this Global Citizen Circle Social Change Initiative Circle, and I'd like to ask the cameraman, rather than staying focused on me, would you please span the entire audience while I'm speaking. Because I really would like to make a point. While there are 60 of us who came from an international delegation from all around the world, many of whom happen to be white like me, we made a very concerted effort that the other 80 of you who are in the room ranged the full spectrum from Khayelitsha students involved with the equal education movement, to township activists, to heads of local organizations, because one of our firmly held beliefs is that we learn from each other. So we're not here to teach you. We're here to learn from you. We're here to engage with you. And your voice, as Monica, Opal, Phumeza, and Heeten has said, is every bit as important as any voice. So we hope that in the course of our shared discussion here, and then when we move into our dinner discussion around small tables where there'll be at least one student at every table, at least one SCI fellow at each table, at least one GCC international delegate at each table, and mostly local South Africans, to know that we are going to take to heart what you teach us. And we also, as Opal said, want to really stand with you as allies, not to dictate to you what you should do or how you should do, but for you to tell us what you need and how you'd like us to stand side by side with you, taking your direction and your insights, because that's the entire underlying principle of these circles, is that everybody can learn from everybody. And so we don't just think it's the elders teaching the young people. We believe the young people can teach the elders as much, possibly more, in our changing world. And so I'm really grateful. I hope the camera is spanning and catching the diversity, the incredible. We have people from every sector: academia, media, business, civil society, local residents, organizers, and it's really what we've started here, we hope will continue. We hope that all of you who are in the room will exchange, if you have cards, share cards. If you don't, write down on a piece of paper, because this is all gonna live on our GCC website, and we want the dialogue to continue. We want to create a network of support for social activists throughout the world, where you have other allies you can call on and count on. And I just want to do a shout out. If you see on our repeat logo, if the camera can switch to the front again, Social Change Initiative, Global Initiative worked really closely with Isivivana Centre and all of the organizations that are based here in inviting each of you and organizing how this program would be run. I want to do a shout out to SNHU, the students who are watching it live stream right now and having a concurrent program. That happens to be where Global Citizen Circle has its home, but I want you to know that there are hundreds of universities around the world who are gathering in auditoriums right now, listening to this dialogue all around the world. So I hope that you will leave here feeling that there's a connection. We believe that programs don't change things, but people change things. And so if we can all walk out of this room feeling empowered as a change maker, then we will have accomplished our goal.
Thank you. Sabu, could the microphone go to Sabu, please? Thank you.
Hello. Amandla. Here you are. Welcome to South Africa. Thank you very much for such a powerful insight from our presenters. My name is Buz Gode. I come from the Shared Dwellers Movement, or rather the Slum Dwellers Movement, Abahlali basemjondolo. Well, my question is around the question of solidarity. I would want just to put this on the panelists. Your views around solidarity, has it worked? How can it be made to work more effectively, both at the national level and maybe international level? I mean, the real solidarity, not solidarity in words. I'm saying this because often many of us are organizing under difficult, really difficult conditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good question.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabo. I think that's
Oh, yeah, please, can I ask something? My name is Alta, and I work right here where we're sitting in the Bertha Movie House. Monica, you were talking about the importance of stories. So some of it happens in our library with Jongi, with community and books, and here it happens with community and movies. And yeah, I'm so happy to host you all here. My question is, as leaders of your organizations, maybe especially Phumeza and Opal, how should we, or how can we think about people who have become sort of cases or catalysts? So I guess Trayvon Martin or Mike Brown, or maybe for us more recently, Michael Komape. How have you dealt with these things where they've, you know, like driven us into action, these people, and what has happened to them, but almost always it's out of deep and painful tragedy, and how did you make them be not just a case and a social movement, but keep them, you know, the people that they are? Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Those are two very good questions to end with. And so what I would like is for each of you to just tackle the question of solidarity and the final question very briefly, and then we'll just sort of finish off.
Yeah, I think those are very important questions. I think the question of solidarity, the question of whether it has worked, yes, there has been challenges of it not working, but whether it's necessary, and I think we all agree as activists that it is necessary. And the question is finding ways of making it work. I think a lot of the times when movements have not partnered, but when they've both been part of creating the strategy, I feel like that resonates better with members than when we talk about solidarity at a leadership level. So, for example, when you get members of one movement to understand and live the issues of another organization, I feel like they better understand the linkages as compared to when we talk about supporting each other on key moments. The second question I think has made struggles when it comes to coordination is we try and create moments that don't exist. What do I mean by that? We try and imagine that the moment is right for us to unite. We'll have a mass movement across the country. We'll riot against either be it safety, be it police violence, be it urban land, but we're not doing the work. And I think the work for me is about building our grassroots. It's about building our work. It's about educating, organizing on the ground, and getting our members to actually understand the linkages. And I think that's a continuous struggle of building movements. And as much as we build our branch structures, we also need to build our partnerships. And partnerships need management. The same as in a relationship, you need to invest in making a relationship work. If it doesn't work, then there's going to be breakups. But I think it's about investing and not just at a speaking level. And that, for me, speaks to a question I think was asked about gender. Gender, for me, is not about having Phumeza, who's a female and who's a gender activist, on the table. It's about translating it to the right. Are you creating the right structures to make sure that women are able to rise up? Are you creating the right platform that women are on the table, not because they're women, but because they're the right people to be on the table? That's how you empower women. And that's also how you build partnerships, that we talk about it, but we're also doing work on the ground. Everyone else might not see that we're actually in solidarity with each other, but if we know that our work contributes to each other. There's no point of me duplicating a campaign that is done by somebody else, because that same campaign is going to speak to the needs of the constituency in which I represent. And so that's where strategy, and that's where utilizing the resources that we have in a way that's to the broader picture. And the last question, I think, about and I think when I started, the question about case studies. For example, Michael Gumape is, as a child, the child died. And we need to be very sensitive to the fact that, yes, there's a person here who had died, and there's a family that is grieving. And there's a family that, yes, we understand why it happened or how it happened, but they're grieving. And as activists, we, in a sense, as much as because we're exposed to some of these issues so much, we get angry rather than be empathetic to the families. And I think for us, as ourselves, we need to be aware of our position as activists. For example, we have organizers that meet families that are in a week that have either had children killed, or they find their children killed and they cut into pieces, or rape or murder. And we don't take care of our own selves, and therefore when we deal with communities, we actually traumatizing our own selves, but also not understanding the psychological implications. It's also that goes with the history of, I would say, Black community, or how we relate to mental disorders or psychological challenges. But every time, and I think this is throughout the organizing in Khayelitsha, and I think lessons from Treatment Action Campaign, is that every time we have an opportunity, when there's a tragedy, when there's a case study, if you want to call it like that, we have an opportunity to link it with the broader systematic issues. If there's a murder of a child because that child fell into a pit toilet at school, it is our responsibility to link it to why there was a pit toilet at school in the first place. Why is that pit toilet not serviced? How was a child of that age able to go to a toilet of that nature on their own? And what is everyone doing about sanitation infrastructure in that community and also at the schools, and be able to hold each other to account? Because I feel like campaigns have much more power when you link it to real struggles, and that's how we're going to change the systematic issues. And the last thing, I don't know if we're going to, and I think for me, organizing is, and I think this speaks to campaigns and strategy and solidarity and partnerships. And I think someone spoke about, someone at the back spoke about leadership in the movement. Organizing, whether we organize today and we'll get what we want tomorrow, but we need to always remind ourselves that when we organize, we empower ourselves. We organize to empower ourselves, that we might get what we want tomorrow, but if we don't get what we want tomorrow, and the next day we may be able to get a much better transformation. And I think that's how we need to think about organizing from all levels, from all campaigns that we look at, from political organizing even. And how do we build institutions? We must first build ourselves. And how do we build our communities? We must first build ourselves. And that's how we're going to develop strategies. And I always sit in awe when I look how hard people organize on the streets. When you see 1,000 people on the streets, you must understand the blood, sweat, and tears that people had to go through to get those people on the streets. But you must also appreciate the investment that those activists actually invest in the community, and the empowerment that it gives to communities. Because a lot of people, frankly, they don't say they're activists, but they want reforms in their own communities. And we need to capitalize on that. And that's how we're going to build mass movements.
The people at the back may not see what's happening here at the front, which to me is solidarity. Can you show me what you're doing? They're doing this, and to me that is when they agree with something, that's solidarity. And we wouldn't know that if you didn't do that. So we have to make it visual. We have to stand up, and the times we have to stand up is beside you. When you are made out to be one of those extremists, it may be a compliment. You're really scaring them, right? You're really getting under their skin. But people need to stand up who are seen as moderates, who are not seen like this, and say, this is my sister. I am standing right beside her on this issue. That's solidarity. And the times when we're discouraged, the work you do must be tremendously hard and you must get burned out. And sometimes somebody just needs to say, come on with me, I'm going to give you some rest. That's solidarity. And at times when we were in crisis in Northern Ireland, the Global Citizenship Circle gave us that rest. Here you call it a retreat, but in Northern Ireland that's a prayer meeting, right? So we don't use that word,
That's right.
right? We just give you time out and residentials. But the Strategic Change Initiative, there are women and men in this room who are mentors. That's solidarity. Because you are able to pass on your experience to those who are coming along and lifting the baton. To me, that is a tremendous initiative. I never had much of a mentor. Actually, my sister was my mentor. And, you know, that I pay tribute to. Everybody needs a rock, and she was my mentor. And I am absolutely certain, Tito, for the people of Boston, you're the symbol of solidarity. And I hope one day you become the mayor soon. So there are all kinds of symbols and signs that make us feel like you finished that beautiful story about it makes you feel empowered. So to you, let's give this clip. And finally, let us say, you know, too much change in my life came through tragedies. I stood at too many funerals and too many people said never again, and we shouldn't have this reoccurrence and we can't have that. And you know, we have enough facts and figures to show that that tragedy shouldn't have been a tragedy, as you say. So my very short and final lesson would be, I've learned in my life that yes, you need to have those inquiries. I'm involved in homicide reviews and child death reviews and particularly looking back on why that woman was killed when everybody knew she was in a completely potentially dangerous situation. Those reviews are so important, but the most important thing is not just the recommendations, it's the follow-up. Who did what, when, and hold them to account. Thank you.
Well, briefly, see you. You know, ultimately, I believe that people of conscience are the majority. We are the majority. I believe that we have the power to transform our world. And I think, you know, clearly by some of the examples we've been sharing all this afternoon, from the experiences that you all have, we know that our lives and our struggles are intertwined. And so myself and the work that I'm doing alongside so many brilliant organizers and community members and leaders in the US is really situated around a practice that says we have to show up consistently for one another, acknowledging that, right? Our destinies are intertwined. And that we can't be doing this kind of one-off transactional solidarity, which was so characteristic of our movements, gosh, you know, a couple years ago, 5, 10, 15 years ago, where much of the experience that I had was, hey, where's the African American community? When are they going to show up for the immigrant rights movement? A lot of this kind of making requests and not recognizing the current conditions that, for example, African Americans were faced with. And there was a kind of almost a cloak where folks in the immigrant community weren't recognizing or weren't able to see that Black Americans were also faced with a number of challenges. And it wasn't until they started seeing the viral videos of Black people being killed in the streets that folks realized, oh wait, there's a very real issue of systemic poverty and criminalization and brutality and extrajudicial killing that's happening. And wait, there might be something going on in their communities and their neighborhoods already that might not allow for folks to show up in the same way. And so what does it look like for us to actually engage with Black struggles in a different type of way? engage with Black Americans in a different way? And what does it look like to also uplift the experiences of, for example, Black immigrants from Africa, the Caribbean, and so on, who are also impacted by these struggles? So all of that to essentially say that we're having a more nuanced conversation and nuanced practice around solidarity that has moved us from this kind of transactional, I show up for you, to a more transformational solidarity that looks at how am I invested in your struggle because I know that is actually me and that is a segment of our community, and if I don't show up and show up consistently, the erosion of our liberties, the erosion of our rights will undoubtedly impact me too. And so that's, I think that's so critical, this move. And one, short example of how some of this is also going on is in the ways that we're fighting against the mass incarceration, or the system of mass incarceration, period, prison-industrial complex, and how it's been growing and expanding over the years where for a period it was okay, right? Black people are criminal, quote unquote criminal, and this was the rhetoric that so many immigrants of color and low-income people were okay with. Those folks over there are engaged in some sort of crime, so of course it's rational, we have to lock them up, blah, blah, blah. But now folks are realizing like there's something bigger going on in our society. There's something going on with the logic of our system and the logic of our society that allows for certain communities to be deemed disposable and allows for them to be locked up and away from us, right? From each other. And so what is, I think, really profound for our movements right now is the ways in which we're understanding how we're all going to be targeted, how we all are being profiled, and how we all have a vested interest in standing up for justice day in and day out. And to be honest, Donald Trump is kind of making it much easier for people to recognize that the assaults are wholesale and that we don't have the luxury of sitting on the sidelines. Like, none of our communities have that luxury.
Well, lots of food for thought that we hope will continue as discussions when we all break over to the hall for dinner and at our table. So I hope that this is a beginning of a discussion. So please join me in really thanking you.
Well done. Well done. You are amazing. You're amazing. You're a real inspiration. You are the next generation, you know that. Thanks. You're the leaders of what?
No, I'm kidding you.
You got it.
I take such great hope the fact that people like you are here.
Oh my God.
And that you're so young,
Monica.
you have so much energy. Tito.
Oh, that's thank you word for
Pleasure.
About to pack it up.
Hi, I'm Melanie, the Senior Coordinator for Global Citizen Circle, and I'll have you introduce yourself and kind of talk about what you just experienced and say a few words.
My name is Kanti. I'm part of the Social Change Initiatives Fellowship Program and part of Masitandane based in Johannesburg. It was an important discussion, and the idea that they have an all-women's panel from countries with such a deep shared history that is in so many ways invisible
quite
what's
something to
happening
have
in
to
the
pick it up
US,
again after he left,
from the spins of Black Lives Matter, what's happening in South Africa post
I was just saying, I'm
1994
glad that he
democracy,
didn't avoid
and
your question.
somehow finding ourselves
Because it
in a
was such
social
an
and
important
political
one.
crisis
And we,
moment.
it takes a much
And as well
longer
what happened
time
in Ireland,
on the
that
geopolitics.
not
Yes,
necessarily
but
a
I'm only
struggle
here.
that is
You guys are
understood.
up on the other
The fact that they
side,
don't even have a
and I'm down in
government
the
at
Cape
the
Town
moment,
side.
like represent
Yeah,
many
yeah.
ways
So we're
of the challenges of like
well, we'll stay in
relying on a
touch here.
system
I'll give
that
you my
provides
card.
a structure and then it
Yes,
completely
I have it
collapses.
here.
And what does it do to like the poor and working class people? One of the most interesting
Just
things
a
I
Saturday.
found, I found the entire thing interesting, but how, for instance, if you think about the setting up of institutions like the United Nations to create a universal declaration on human rights, and yet the social and economic rights are like some of the most, seems like unattainable rights of all, and yet they cause not only divisions and fragility in relation of how we build movements, but also in relation to really what is that aspiration of real felt full enjoyment of human rights and the achievement of social justice. So a very useful and important conversation that certainly I know in the movements where I work, it's like an ongoing conversation of not only reflection, but also of thinking where to and how to. Thanks.
Okay, my name is Sharani Kambaram. I work with Lawyers for Human Rights. And I think, I agree with Phumeza. I think this is an incredibly important conversation. I think what's more important is that it's across borders, it's international, and we can all learn lessons because global capitalism is organizing itself against poor people, dividing and causing mayhem in the world, and we have to start getting organized across nations. And the key here for me is we can see the power we have in bringing our struggles together, in struggles for unity, solidarity. And, I can't help but feel at the same time quite sad at the enormity of the suffering that's taking place, particularly against black people internationally. If you think about migrants in our country, we have institutional xenophobia against black migrants coming into our country, similar to what's happening in Europe and America. And I feel quite despondent, but this has made me feel very heartened that there's and what's really critically important for today is the voice of young people.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, let's see if we can find a few more people. Would you like to make a comment about what you just experienced or say anything?
Yes, I think this is a very important interaction for particularly young activists in South Africa because we need space for them to be able to hear other people's stories because they have a huge mountain to climb in this country, and particularly in this city. So I thought that what we heard this afternoon is very important in terms of moving forward so that they know that there is support out there for their activities.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perfect. Ready? Would you please introduce yourself and share some thoughts?
My name is Nelly Ortiz. I'm from Nicaragua. I study in Taiwan. I got a scholarship in 2009, and I studied global political economics, and it was a really amazing experience to be in Taiwan. And now I decided to going back to Nicaragua because I believe that I can do more things in Nicaragua than outside. I am really prepared to go home because Nicaragua needs people who love the country and bring new ideas because nowadays we are facing very difficult situation in many regions. In one of the cases, we have a big example is Venezuela. And I feel Nicaragua have to learn a lot for this country. And something similar is happening in Nicaragua. And I believe that if we have a people who love the country and they believe to find the right way and respect the people's rights and continue believing and improve the society and allow people to participate.
Thank you, Nelly. Thank you. Alrighty. Well, thank you very much for watching. Oh, perfect. Actually, we have a special treat, Tito Jackson, who just actually ran for mayor of Boston. He'll come over and say a few words on his thoughts. Perfect. All right, Tito, I'll let you take it from here.
No, so I feel very empowered. In particular, listening to these powerful women really school us on the need, in particular, for solidarity, but also to be very, very thoughtful and proactive about the inclusion of women and in the structures that we are putting forward. But also, I think there's the issues around sustainability, and you heard people beginning to speak about mental health issues, and that's aspect of sustainability in terms of activism, because activism is not only dealing with the issues, but we are people in these movements, and we have to deal with and sustain ourselves, our families, our communities, and uplift them also. But the other component is that of active solidarity. And you know, it's one thing to say, hey, we got your back, but I'm way back. No, we're not talking about that. But we're talking about, as Black Lives Matter matters is getting targeted by the FBI, that as an elected official, I have to step up and say something. Right? And that we can't stand idly by and see organizations that are actually changing the face of what's happening in our electoral politics, in our policy making, and allow them to be targeted again by the FBI, because this is just a second version of COINTELPRO, which is what took out the Black Panther Party, which took out many aspects of other leadership. And also to hear it from Monica, an Irish sister, to be able to speak to what's happening there, and the real need for us to really come together and deal with, and she was speaking about people who are getting out of jail, people who are in paramilitary organizations, and how we sustain and build sustainable processes for them. So I'm actually elated. I've never been to Africa before, and being in South Africa is off the chain, off the heezy fo sheezy. That's technical terminology. But I'm also going to take back what's happening here, because we can learn, and we're not here to teach. We're here as all students of one another to see what's happening here. And I would finally say this is one of the most optimistic things I have attended in a long time. All of this young energy and all of this energy of young people challenging us around the manner in which we do things is exactly what we need. Shout out to Global Citizen Circle and the amazing work, as well as SCI, that they're doing to uplift us all.
Thank you, Tito. Thank you very much.
And shout out to the folks like you, sister, who work your butt off to make it happen.
Thank you. Alrighty, would you please share a few words and thoughts and something you learned from today?
My name is Mosoli. I learned a few things. But what I was interested on is to understand based on a global citizen. If, let's say, they are trying to advance the citizenship of the world, of the globe, is it possible for us, like, to share equal power, to share equal privileges, also to close the gap between inequality? Because I wanted to learn more on that part, because we within the society, we see each other as black and white. Others see each other as Indian and whatever. So I think, like, the bigger picture is, if, let's say, we see each other as one citizen, also we see each other as humans rather than colors, I think we will be trying to address the cause. Also, the other thing that I think we will be addressing is, if we talk about equality, so everyone can share equal privileges. I might be black, have my own privileges, but other fellow brothers are not having privileges. You might be white and having privileges, but other fellow white people are not having privileges. So we can only advance the cause only if we understand the challenges that we're having. If it's inequality, let's address inequality so that everyone can share equality. If it's a matter of privilege, let's share the privileges with other people so that we can know how do we identify ourselves as people within this planet. That's what I'm thinking. So my interest was more on how do we put a picture on addressing equality across the world. Thanks.
Thank you, and I think you make a very good point about seeing people as a human race together, and definitely write that question down, because I think that's something we should definitely address, and come chat with me later after dinner. Okay, thank you. Alrighty. Yes, could you please introduce yourself and say a few words about what you experienced today?
Thank you. I'm Becky Keshet from Israel. I'm on the SCI program. And I really appreciated being here today because I think it's so easy for activists to be centered on their own problems, our problems of our own country, and it's really important to step back and hear from people in other places, in other contexts. There's so many similarities. There's so many amazing things other people are doing, and I think it really gives hope and gives new insights. And it was beautiful being at an all-women's panel of women from different places in the world, different ages. I really appreciated hearing a woman from Ireland who has so much experience, and hearing very young women here who also have a lot of experience, but are coming from a different generation. And I think that it's learning from the variety, from the difference in ages and different places in the world, and different experiences, which can really strengthen us and help us build better strategies, better ways of working. I'm going to take home ideas that I got here, and I believe that everyone here will take away something from here, a bit more hope and a bit more and new thoughts about how to deal with our problems. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Becky. Alrighty, we're Senator Rodney from the United. Alrighty. So would you please address? Would you please name yourself and you're from, and just a few thoughts from what you heard today?
So I'm Rodney Ellis. I'm a county commissioner in Harris County, which is Houston, Texas. I know you're wondering what is a county commissioner. So I'm an elected official for about 26 years. I was a state senator. So I've been active with the Global Citizen Circle since I was as young as you are. This was a very inspirational session today. I was very impressed to see that these young people are so energetic, much more intellectual than I was when I was that age, and I thought that I was an activist. So it really gives me a lot of hope for the future. I think it's good to have such a diverse group from all around the world to come and talk about ideas, exchange ideas on what they can do, what they can learn to take back to their various communities. And it was truly an inspirational chance to be with Bishop Tutu and his beautiful wife again, and think about what examples they have been, not just for people in South Africa, but all around the world. And it reminded me of how fortunate I was to get to know him when he and Winnie Mandela were making the rounds throughout the United States. And I thought about names like Alan Bosak and other icons of the social justice movement here in South Africa, and how far they have come, and also think and reflect on how far they still have to go to get things right.
Right. Thank you very much, Rodney. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much for watching online. I hope you can continue the conversation online, stay connected with the Global Citizen Circle, and thanks again for watching.